Somewhere right now, a grave is sitting untouched. No flowers, no visitors, no one who remembers the name carved into the stone. And if you believe that death is simply the end, that's fine. That's just an empty grave. But what if it isn't? What if somewhere, in whatever comes after this, the person who used to answer to that name is still, waiting? This is the question that philosophers refuse to answer, that scientists couldn't prove, and that every single human being who has ever lost someone has quietly asked in the dark. Can the dead feel loneliness? And the answer, depending on which direction you come at it from, is either deeply comforting or the most disturbing thing you've ever heard. Let's start with the living. Because to understand what the dead might feel, you first have to understand what loneliness actually is. Most people think loneliness means being alone. It doesn't. In 2008, psychologist John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago published research that changed how scientists think about loneliness entirely. He had spent decades studying the difference between solitude and loneliness, and what he found was this: loneliness is not about how many people are around you, it's about whether you feel seen. Cacioppo put it simply: you can be in a room full of people and be the loneliest person alive, and you can be completely alone in a forest and feel no loneliness at all. The difference is not physical presence, the difference is connection. The feeling that somewhere, someone knows you exist and it matters to them. This distinction matters enormously for what comes next. Because if loneliness is not about physical isolation, if it's about the absence of being known, then the question of whether the dead can feel it becomes something much more complicated than it first appears. Now here's where it gets strange. In 2023, a team of resuscitation researchers published what has become one of the most quietly unsettling studies in modern medicine. Dr. Sam Parnia at New York University had spent over 2 decades collecting testimony from people who had been clinically dead, heart stopped, no measurable brain activity, and then brought back. What he found was not what anyone expected. 40% of cardiac arrest survivors reported some form of conscious experience during the time they were clinically dead. Not vague impressions, not confusion, structured thoughts, clear awareness, a sense of existing somewhere that was not the hospital room their body was lying in. And the most consistent thing they reported, across different ages, different cultures, different countries, was this: they did not feel alone. Almost universally, people who came back described a presence. Sometimes it was a deceased relative, a grandparent standing at the edge of something, a parent who had died years before, looking younger than they ever remembered them, reaching out. One woman described her mother, who had died when she was 7, standing in a place that had no walls and no floor and no ceiling, just light. Her mother did not speak. She simply looked at her daughter the way she had when she was small. The woman said it was the least lonely she had ever felt in her entire life. Now, science does not know what to do with this. The skeptical answer is straightforward. A dying brain, flooded with stress hormones and deprived of oxygen, produces hallucinations. The mind, in its final moments, constructs comfort the same way it constructs dreams. Out of memory, out of longing, out of whatever the person most needs to see. That's the rational explanation. But here's the problem with that explanation. In several documented cases, people who were clinically dead and reportedly had these experiences were later able to describe things that happened in the room while their heart was stopped, conversations between nurses, the position of equipment, things they should not have been able to see or hear. Dr. Parnia calls this the hard problem of consciousness research. He doesn't claim to have an answer. He just says the data doesn't fit the simple version of the story. And that gap, that small, uncomfortable gap between what science can explain and what people actually report, is exactly where this question lives. But let's go back further, much further, because humans have been asking whether the dead feel lonely for as long as humans have existed. And the answers they gave say something remarkable about us. In ancient Egypt, families did not simply bury their dead and walk away. They returned regularly. They brought food, left water, spoke to the person in the tomb as if they could hear, because they believed they could. The Egyptian concept of the soul was not one thing. It was several. The Ka, roughly translated as the life force, remained near the body after death. The Ba, closer to what we might call personality or spirit, could travel. But the Ka needed to be fed, needed to be spoken to, needed to know it was not forgotten. An unvisited grave in ancient Egypt was not just sad, it was a crisis. Because a Ka that was not tended to would suffer. The Egyptians took this seriously enough that wealthy people paid professional mourners for generations after their death. People whose entire job was to return to the tomb, speak the name of the dead, and make sure no one was left alone. In Japan, the Obon festival exists for the same reason. Every August, families light lanterns to guide the spirits of their ancestors home. They set out food. They clean the graves. The entire cultural logic of Obon is built on one assumption, that the dead know whether you showed up or not. In Mexico, Dia de los Muertos is not mourning, it is a reunion. The belief is explicit. The dead return on those 2 days, and if no one has set up an altar, if no one has placed their favorite food or a photograph, if no one has said their name, they will wander through the world of the living feeling lost and unrecognized. These are not primitive superstitions from people who didn't know better. These are thousands of years of human beings arriving at the same conclusion independently, that the dead know, that the dead feel, that forgetting someone is not just sad for the living, it is an act that reaches all the way to wherever they are. Now here's the part that nobody talks about. Modern neuroscience has discovered something about memory and identity that makes this question even harder to dismiss. When you die, in the first minutes, before the brain fully shuts down, something happens that researchers are still struggling to explain. In 2023, neuroscientist Jim Oborzigan at the University of Michigan monitored 4 patients as they died. What she expected was a gradual dimming, brain activity winding down like a phone losing its last battery. That is not what happened. In 2 of the 4 patients, the moment oxygen stopped reaching the brain, there was a surge, a massive, organized explosion of gamma wave activity, the same brain waves associated with heightened consciousness, memory retrieval, and vivid dreaming. Concentrated in the region linked to visual processing and out-of-body experiences, the brain did not go quiet at the end, it went loud. Borzigan described the activity as, in her own words, crazy high. What does that surge contain? What is the brain doing in that final explosion of activity? We don't know. But people who have come back from clinical death describe something that might be an answer. They describe a life review, not just the big moments, but all of it. The ordinary Tuesday afternoons, the faces of people they had forgotten they loved, the feeling of being known completely, by something, by someone in a way they had never felt while they were alive. And almost none of them, almost none, describe feeling alone. So let's bring this back to the question. Can the dead feel loneliness? There are 3 honest answers. The first is no. Death is the end of all experience. There is no one left to feel anything. The grave is just a grave. Whatever we feel when we stand at one is ours, not theirs. The second answer is maybe. The data from resuscitation research is real. The brain activity at the moment of death is real. What it means is genuinely unknown. Science has not closed this question. It has only made it more complicated. And the third answer is the one that has been given by nearly every civilization that has ever existed on this planet. Yes, not as a horror, not as a punishment, but as a reason. A reason to go back to the grave, to say the name, to light the lantern, to set out the food, to tell the story at the dinner table so the person who is gone is still, in some form, present. Every culture that has ever believed the dead can feel loneliness has built something around that belief. A ritual, a festival, a day of return. Not out of fear, out of love. Because if there is even a chance that whoever you lost is somewhere, and that somewhere they can tell the difference between being remembered and being forgotten, then the most human thing you can do is make sure they know. The loneliest thing in the world might not be lying in a grave with no visitors. It might be standing at a grave and realizing you waited too long to come. The dead cannot tell us what they feel, but we already know what we feel when we forget them. And maybe that is the answer that was there the whole time.